In the spring of 2022, two of the largest companies in the defense and technology sector were weeks away from completing one of the most ambitious mergers in corporate history. Lawyers had spent months negotiating. Bankers had modeled every scenario. Executives had shaken hands in boardrooms on 3 continents. Shareholders were already pricing in the deal. Then someone hit send. One email, forwarded to the wrong person, flagged by a compliance officer, and suddenly sitting on the desk of a federal regulator who hadn't known what to look for until now. Within 72 hours, the deal was under formal review. Within 6 months, it was dead. The names don't matter as much as what the story reveals, because this wasn't a fluke. It was the logical conclusion of something that had been building for years. A quiet but seismic shift in how governments, regulators, and the public think about corporate power. And the email was just the moment it all became visible. To understand why a single piece of internal communication could collapse a multi-billion-dollar agreement, you need to understand what mergers actually are and what they've become. On the surface, a merger is a financial transaction. Company A buys Company B, usually for a premium above market value, and the combined entity is supposed to be worth more than its parts. Synergies, the bankers call it, a word that typically means we'll cut costs, consolidate operations, and grow faster together than we could apart. That's the pitch. And for most of the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, regulators largely accepted it. The framework was simple. If a merger didn't obviously reduce competition in a specific market, it was probably fine. If consumers still had choices, the deal went through. Antitrust law was interpreted narrowly. Big was not inherently bad. Growth was good. The market would sort out the rest. What changed wasn't the law at first, it was the evidence. Researchers started noticing something in the data. Industries that had undergone major consolidation, airlines, hospitals, pharmaceuticals, agricultural inputs, weren't behaving the way the models predicted. Prices weren't falling. Innovation wasn't accelerating. In many cases, the opposite was happening. A landmark 2016 study found that US industries had become significantly more concentrated over the previous 2 decades. A 2019 paper from economists at the University of Chicago, not exactly a hotbed of anti-market sentiment, documented that corporate concentration was suppressing wages in addition to raising prices. The argument that mergers were simply neutral financial events was becoming harder to sustain. What the email did, in the deal we're talking about, was confirm something regulators had suspected but couldn't prove: that the stated rationale for the merger, innovation, efficiency, better products, was not the primary motivation. What the email revealed, in the blunt language of an internal strategy session, was that the acquisition was designed to neutralize a competitor before it became a threat. That's called a killer acquisition. And it had been happening across the economy for years, mostly invisibly. Think about what that looks like in practice. A large pharmaceutical company acquires a small biotech startup not because it wants to develop the startup's drug, but because the drug, if developed, would compete with one of the company's most profitable existing products. The acquisition is announced as a commitment to innovation. The drug is quietly shelved. The patents are buried. The scientists disperse. Consumers never know what they didn't get. The market records a transaction, not a loss. The same pattern has played out in technology, in agriculture, in medical devices. A Harvard Business School study estimated that between 5 and 15% of all pharmaceutical acquisitions by major companies were killer acquisitions. Deals whose primary purpose was suppression rather than development. The drugs that don't exist because of those deals can't be counted. That's precisely what makes the strategy so difficult to prosecute, until someone writes it down. The email in question was not written by a villain. That's important to say clearly. It was written by a senior executive during a strategy meeting, in the shorthand that executives use when they think they're speaking privately. It said, in effect, that the target company was more dangerous as an independent player than as an acquisition, and that bringing them inside would allow the acquiring company to manage the timeline on competing technologies. Manage the timeline. It's the kind of phrase that sounds almost reasonable in context and devastating out of it. When the Federal Trade Commission obtained that email during document discovery, it didn't just change the legal calculus, it changed the narrative. Suddenly, the deal's supporters couldn't argue that the government was imposing ideology on a neutral business transaction. There was a document, there was intent, there was a story. The companies fought back, hard. Their lawyers argued the email was taken out of context, that strategy discussions necessarily involve competitive considerations, that the FTC was criminalizing normal business language. Those arguments weren't frivolous. Courts have historically given companies significant benefit of the doubt in these cases. But the timing was wrong. The political and regulatory environment had shifted underneath them in ways they hadn't fully registered. The Biden administration had appointed antitrust regulators who were explicitly committed to a more aggressive posture. Lina Khan at the FTC, Jonathan Kanter at the Justice Department, both of whom had spent years in academia arguing that the old framework was broken. For the first time in decades, the presumption in a major merger review was not that the deal was probably fine. The deal collapsed under the weight of that presumption, accelerated by the email that confirmed every concern the regulators already had. What this ultimately reveals is the fragility of a system built on trust in private judgment. For 30 years, corporate deal-making operated on a kind of honor system. Executives said their mergers were about growth and innovation. Regulators mostly took them at their word because the legal standards required proof of harm that was genuinely difficult to establish. The system functioned, not perfectly but tolerably, as long as the stated rationale and the actual motivation weren't too far apart. When that gap became too large to ignore, something had to give. The email was a crack in the wall, but the wall had been weakening for a long time. Every overpriced prescription drug, every airline that raised fees after a merger was approved, every small competitor that mysteriously disappeared after being acquired, these were deposits in an account of public skepticism that had been accumulating quietly for years. The world of corporate mergers, after this moment, is not dramatically different in structure. Companies still merge. Regulators still review them. Most deals still go through. But something has changed in the atmosphere. A new wariness on both sides. Executives now know that internal communications are discoverable. Strategy sessions that used to happen verbally, informally, over dinner, are being conducted with more caution. Legal teams are reviewing documents not just for accuracy, but for how they'd look in a courtroom 2 years from now. And regulators have demonstrated something that hadn't been clearly established in a generation: that intent matters, that stated rationale can be challenged, and that the right document, surfaced at the right moment, can unravel years of preparation. Whether that's a healthy correction or regulatory overreach is a debate worth having, and one that will continue through the courts, through elections, through shifts in political power. But one thing is no longer debatable: the idea that what happens inside a boardroom stays inside a boardroom. It doesn't. It never really did.